Brilliant. Thank you so much, Saima, and thank you for putting this together as well. Really looking forward to the panel discussion today. So I'm Grace. I'm the Regional Manager for South Asia at the University of York. The University of York is pleased to be partnered with STEPS in Pakistan, who can support you on your next steps to York. York is a fantastic Russell Group university in the United Kingdom. We have the Teaching Excellence Framework Gold Award, and we're really highly ranked across many of our departments, but particularly the Department of English and Related Literature, where we're 4th in the United Kingdom according to the Times and Sunday Times Good University Guide, and we're 22nd in the world according to the QS World University Rankings this year by subject as well. But I'm sure that we want to get on to discussing reading in the time of coronavirus. So without further ado, I'll pass on to Professor Claire Chambers to kickstart this panel discussion. So thank you, Claire.
Thank you. Thanks very much for having me. It's a real honour to moderate this panel for STEPS and for University of York today with the eminent authors Bina Shah, Osama Siddique and Aysha Baqir. You can read their full bios online and in the publicity. So I just want to flag up just one key work for each of them. For Aysha Baqir, it's last year's novel Beyond the Fields. Osama Siddique is his novel Snuffing Out the Moon, which was really highly acclaimed. And Bina Shah, perhaps, you know, there's too many to mention, but we'll go for Before She Sleeps, the most recent novel. So I hope you'll search out more from these writers once you've heard them today. But let's just dive straight into the topic of reading in the time of coronavirus. And I wanted to begin by talking, you know, a little bit about the personal for a few questions, and then we'll maybe move outwards to the political and think more broadly. So I think starting with Aysha, perhaps, could I just ask each of you, how did you spend the pandemic in the city where you lived? If you could just tell us a bit about your experiences at this historic moment, really. And we'll go to Aysha first.
Thanks, Claire. So I was in Lahore in February for the Lahore Literary Festival, and at that time, Singapore, where I reside, was in the orange sort of state, you know, sort of the orange alert, which means it hasn't gone into a lockdown, but things are serious. And when I arrived in Lahore, you know, things were as usual, business was as usual, and people weren't very aware of coronavirus. And, you know, 10 days later, when I arrived in Singapore, it was getting more serious. But, you know, the Singapore government is brilliant when it comes to managing and organizing and ensuring systems are in place. So I think within 2 weeks, we had not gone into lockdown, but something called a circuit breaker, which means that you need to only get out as and when needed, and you are, you know, sort of traced when you step out, and only for essentials. And I think, you know, a quiet and a silence spread in a very, very small city state. Since I'm, you know, my husband then started to work from home, and suddenly everybody was sharing a space which had, well, you know, at least been mine, only mine for half a day at least. So suddenly I found myself sort of ousted from my study and onto the dining table, which became my new desk, you know, and it was the center of everybody's sort of, my boys used to pass from there. So I think I had a space and time to delve into books that I enjoyed, you know, my brilliant friend by Elena Ferrante, you know, The Narrative Life of Frederick Douglass, and a few others. And I think I started to explore worlds which I hadn't the time to do before. My boys were old enough to study online by themselves. They're both sort of, you know, in middle school and high school. So I think, I think for me, and I'm privileged enough to say that the circuit breaker was really spent in exploring voices which I hadn't the time to do so before. But I think when I speak to my friends, it was different. Some went into the comfort mode, you know, going into books they'd already read, the classics. That's how my lockdown was.
That's great. And Osama, what about you? How did you experience this year, really?
So thanks a lot for this. Lovely to be here to be able to speak about this. It's obviously been a fairly solitary journey for a lot of people. Lahore had an early lockdown, which in some ways was a good idea. And then we've had a mixed kind of an experience. I was in Lahore throughout. I'd just come back from abroad as well. And soon after, we went into, quite a few people went into self-quarantine, including myself. I would say that, first of all, by and large, I've been incredibly fortunate. I think writers are used to being reclusive. You do seek solitude. You do learn to live with your own company, no matter how odious it is. And you try and not impose yourself too much on others because writers can be cranky. But I've been very fortunate. I did not really find this entire period to be very different from my usual routine in terms of writing, reading. Yes, a lot of the personal interaction was very much missed, and it took some time to get used to doing business. I'm a lawyer and a legal academic, so there are other parallel lives carrying on. But I think technology worked very well. I think very refreshingly, one managed to speak to very many new audiences because a lot of universities, including public sector universities, started holding webinars, and you'd get invites from all sorts of interesting people. So I think it also allowed us to step out of our comfort zone and engage with more people. In terms of reading, I think it's been, I've barely written anything, but I've tried to read a lot, and I think somehow I had the concentration, so I made the most of it. So for me, it has been multiple phases because we're already talking about 6, 7, 8 months. And if I were to speak about the books I've read, it is going back to, as Aysha saying, the classics and comfort books, which we want to read. But I think there has been a lot of curiosity. So I've been reading a lot about pandemics. One always read about pandemics and plagues and fiction. But when you actually encounter it, it's a very humbling experience. It's also an incredibly disturbing experience because no matter what you say, even if you are securely tucked away, you have anxiety for those who are more vulnerable. You have anxiety for a lot of people who are having to step out. So I read a lot of stuff. There were times when I only wanted to read Urdu. There were times when I wanted to read the classic epics in Urdu. There were times when I wanted to go away from fiction and read nonfiction, and especially science. I guess you are in the questioning existentialist kind of mode. And so I literally sort of read as it pleased me. And I've developed this habit, I don't know whether it's good or bad, it works for me, of reading multiple books simultaneously. And that sort of worked very well during this period.
And Bina, tell us a bit about your experience and also your reading habits.
So I was in Karachi and I'm still here, and we locked down hard and we locked down fast. I think the Sindh government was the first to really raise the alarm, and they closed the schools before even the general lockdown happened. And then the lockdown itself happened. And those were, I think it was about 6 weeks of solid lockdown. And then the lockdown lifted in stages until we got back to almost normality. It was very lonely. It was an anxiety-making time. I found myself reaching for comfort books, and I found myself reaching for genres that I would not normally read. I read actually, I read a bunch of romance novels, which is just not normal for me. But it was just the comfort and the predictability that, oh, it was going to be a happy ending, and it was something that my mind didn't have to work too hard on mentally, because being in a pandemic is mentally exhausting. And so I was reading those. Then I seemed to fixate on authors and then just read everything I could find by a certain author. So I started with The Dutch House by Anne Patchett, and then I liked it so much I went on to Commonwealth by Anne Patchett, and then I liked that so much that I went on and read Bel Canto, which is her most famous work about an opera singer held hostage in South America for 4 months. And that was a book that really mirrored what we are going through, actually. And then I read a bunch of books by, who's the person that wrote The Wife? I'm just going to look this up. Because I'd seen the movie and I really loved it. Meg Wolitzer. So I read The Wife by Meg Wolitzer because I'd seen the movie, and then I really liked a lot of her work. So I was reading as much of her as I could find. Spent a lot of money on Kindle, buying books that I couldn't go out to actually buy. Our habits of reading, I think, changed a lot during this time, and they still haven't really calibrated back to what I would say pre-pandemic habits. And then in the middle of the pandemic, I started writing. So I'm working on a new novel at the moment, and I managed to put in quite a lot of good, solid work on that, surprisingly. I couldn't at first. I couldn't concentrate on very much, but I found my rhythm.
This is great. So we're already touching on some of the things I wanted to talk to you about. And quite a few people, I think all three of you have mentioned comfort reading. So I want to ask each of you, what does literature offer readers, maybe apart from comfort? Is it escapism, a guidebook, a diary, you know, in terms of your writing perhaps, catharsis, or holding the mighty to account? What sort of things do you think that literature gives us? And I'm going to go in the same order, I think, with Aysha first.
So I think it's a bit of everything. I think there's definitely entertainment. There's escapism. I think there was also a need for us, or for me as a reader, to try and find, almost an agency in the pandemic, why it was happening. And so a bit of science fiction for a while, until you started to realize that, well, it's really got to do more with us and our behavior, and rather than anything else. So there was a bit of that, and for me, comfort reading is also books I've read before, and you want to reread them because you want to get. I think when the silence falls outside, you find new meaning in literature. So you can read the same book and find sort of new meanings and new themes. And so there's entertainment, escapism, comfort, and also a sort of an attempt to find some reason to why all of this is happening around the world.
Right. Osama, what about you? You turned to the Urdu and to some classics as well, but you said that you were also interested in pandemic literature.
Yes. So in addition to what Aysha has said, I guess one thing which I thought was very important to develop was perspective. I think one of the banes of modernity is that we centralize everything so much, and we sort of consider ourselves the pivot of everything. And I think it's instructive to see how humanity has dealt with these challenges before, and we sort of assume that those reactions were somehow less nuanced, but that may not necessarily be the case. So I went back to a book which I'd read a very long time ago, which I thought I should read again, which is 𝐂𝐸𝐬𝐽's The Plague. And much as it's a fictional account, I thought that it was remarkably insightful in terms of the irrationality of how disease spreads, and also the irrationality at times of what our reaction is. And yet when I compared it to Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year, it was quite remarkable even how so many centuries ago, some of the things which they did under the circumstances, considering that they did not quite know how the plague spread, were quite modern, quite remarkably sort of insightful. For example, quarantining people in their houses. Now there were issues with that, and there are lots of tragedies, when houses were set on fire or people got sick of it. And this human impulse to escape confinement, to escape this kind of order. And one can well imagine the anguish, with the bodies going and all that. So you could say it was a bit morbid, but I think and there are other books. There's literature in Urdu, of course, which talks about plagues about 100 years ago. And, so I think both from a psychological standpoint, but also sociological reactions to things. And then coming to Urdu, increasingly, there are times and there are moods in which, you want to read in a particular language if you have that privilege. And for me, epic literature has always been incredibly important. So I went to some of the lesser known epic stories in Urdu, like 𝐶𝐸𝐻𝐻𝐼 or 𝐂𝐨𝐫𝐲𝐵 These are epic, Urdu is known for its epic stories. And then there's, of course, the really long epics like 𝐓𝐢𝐦𝐞 Dastani Amir Hamza. And then Arabian Nights, I don't know what happened. It's irrational, but I sort of collected about 8 different translations of Arabian Nights because I just consider it such a mother of all stories kind of a literary output. And then reading Arabian Nights in an Urdu translation in verse, which is by this very famous writer, Pandit Ratan Nath Sarshar. So that was there. But then there are lots of stuff which, one felt like going back to Shakespeare. One felt like going back to Don Quixote. Things which one had read, but, those are the comfort books, or those are the books which still give you insights. And then a fair bit of modern literature, not as modern as what has been mentioned earlier. I'm fairly patchy in terms of really reading what has been produced over the last 10, 15 years. But yes, I went to Kazuo Ishiguro. There were novels I hadn't read. And then also a bit of science, because I consider myself so illiterate when it comes to that. So I read some wonderful books. Most particularly, I would mention The Meaning of Human Existence, which is by Edward O. Wilson. And the title itself can tell you that there was an impetus to revisit the meaning of human existence. And then Brian Greene's The Fabric of the Cosmos, because, you also need to sometimes step away and try and look at your existence in the grand scheme of things, because everything seems so overwhelming. So there are a whole bunch of others, but yeah, it sort of really gravitated between all these things, and somehow it worked for me. It kept me sane, hopefully.
And Bina, finally, and the question was about what reading can give us, what you derive from it, as well as comfort.
So I think in the case of reading as literature, as with any art really is the thing that gives us hope, because art is the one thing that fires the imagination, and imagination is the vehicle for hope. So I think by reading, and by reading obsessively or extensively, or turning to reading as relief from the horrors of the outside world, you are stimulating that part of yourself that has hope. That is what reading did for me during this time, and has done throughout my life. Because when you can use your imagination, you're turning away from grim realities, you're turning away from what you might find hard to accept, and you're turning your mind towards very pleasurable things, you're turning your mind towards stimulating things, intellectual things, comforting things. And throughout all of that, you are stimulating hope. You're saying that you're finding, and you're saying to yourself, well, there are other worlds, there are other times, there are other places other than the here and now, and the very immediate and the very painful. And also, reading is freedom. It's your choice. What is it that you're going to dive into? What you have such grand choice. Not one of us has mentioned reading the same books. So, it's sort of a measure of your individuality against this great sort of feeling of being all sort of stuck in the same boat, if that makes sense.
And I want to pick up on something, Bina, you said earlier, and then it was reinforced in Grace's point in the chat, which is about, how reading is changing, and how the pandemic, you said, for you, it was Kindle. So it's much easier than you could, if you can't go to the shops, you'll get an ebook. And then in the chat, Grace mentioned Audible, which I think has seen a surge. So I just wonder what you think the future of reading is, given everything that's going on. Do you see ebooks or, audiobooks or other forms as coming up, Aysha?
Well, it's interesting. I started work on my second novel, and what happened, I found myself browsing the internet a lot. And when you talk about reading, it's just not novels, but articles and research. And I felt I was hopping from one sort of, academic resource to another. And that constituted a large chunk of my sort of time. And I had the time to do it. Now, I'm not sure whether that, it was because everything else had come to a stop. And but at the same time, I felt that my concentration was limited, because somebody would come out and, the numbers would come out again. And it was almost obsessive, the way the compulsion to go and check, how many more cases and what's happening in in each country, and especially Pakistan, because my family is in Pakistan, and I'm straddled between the two countries. And so I found that where I had the access to the net and to Kindle, and here in Singapore, you can sort of delve into the library through electronic means, and I had all the access, and although I didn't have the hard copies, but at the same time, I found that my attention span was limited, and I was almost hopping between some of the sources I had. So I think the way where we rely upon information, the way we read, it does change by the fact, because when the circuit breaker or the lockdown happens, your life changes, and as your behavior changes, you seek to then compensate in new ways and to sort of adjust to that mode.
I could say something to your question, Claire, which is that I think, unfortunately, in Pakistan, I think Kindle and ebooks and Audible have a limited viability for now, because you have to have a foreign bank account or a foreign credit card to sign up for them. We still don't have Amazon Pakistan. So the vast majority of people cannot access these resources. So I don't think that we're going to catch on anytime soon to ebooks, and it's still the good old, sir, can you send me a soft copy PDF of your book? And then you do that, and then you find it's like pirated on the everywhere. And that's not what you want to have happen. So until we find a way to make ebooks and, accessible, but also sort of pirate proof, I don't know how we're going to get there.
That's a useful reminder.
So one thing which has changed, though, is that to the extent that the copyright has expired on a lot of books, the classics, and they are now available online, the Gutenberg project, so many others. A lot of archival material which is now made available. So those students who want to seek it out, and not just students, even researchers, faculty, there is a whole lot out there now on the internet which would not have been accessible before. And here there is no copyright violation. So much as I agree with Bina that we need a lot of these new kinds of sort of tools available more widely, and they are a game changer. I think reading habits in terms of accessing books which are not otherwise available. A lot of colonial era texts, for example, which I need to look up, are now available. In my case, though, in terms of personal choice, since a lot of work I do, whether it's policy related work or law, is also on screen, in the sense that so much of the engagement takes place there. When it comes to reading for pleasure or reading as a writer or fiction, I'm very old-fashioned, I must say. I still love the book in my hands. I think the edition matters to me. The smell of the paper matters to me. The memory associated with the particular purchase matters to me. I don't think it's the most environmentally friendly approach to have, but I still love the idea of a personal library. If anything, I have regressed, if one can use that word, in the sense that over these last 7-8 months, the only shopping I've done is books, and that too books wherever I could find some affordable first editions. Also, a lot of the books I was looking for are out of print, so they are scarce to speak as it is, especially in Urdu. And I needed them for my own research, but I've really relished the experience of getting my hands on these books.
Great. Well, turning to the bit more political side of things, just thinking about propaganda and politicians trying to spin good news, especially now with, seeing vaccines coming out, and, people profiteering early on from PPE and things like that. And I just wondered what you thought writers' role was in the political side. I think I'll start with Bina, because you're, quite prominent in the media. You've got that aspect of being a public intellectual and journalist. So yeah, and you're good at it. So it'd be nice to hear what you think writers' intervention can be.
Very hard. I found myself not really. I wanted to observe for a good long time before I felt I could have a political response to everything that was happening. I felt it wasn't my place to insert myself into the conversation. because I'm just a writer. I'd rather hear from the scientists, and I'd rather hear from our leadership, and I would rather hear from our medical workers and the people that are at the top. I wanted them to sort of lead us and guide us and talk to us about what was happening. And it was sad to see very quickly that in Pakistan, even the issue of the lockdown became politicized, because suddenly you had sort of provincial governments going at each other about whether there should be a lockdown or not be a lockdown. And there you could see a definite schism of political thought that was prompted by, and I think this is mirrored all over the world, what we saw in Pakistan happening first, then went to the UK, then the whole thing became politicized there, it went to the US, even mask wearing became politicized. So that was very disappointing. It was a very disappointing thing to see, that we were not able to transcend or put some things first, which is basically the health and safety of humanity. And we still sort of crumbled or descended into the lowest common denominator, which was really, what political mileage can I get out of handing over PPE to people, or what political mileage can I get out of making decisions about people's lives? What political mileage, what can I do to sort of hit at my opposition to say that they're not doing things enough as they should be, or their response is inadequate, blah, 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 blah. So that was, yeah.
Aysha, Aysha, I was interested in what you said about being in Singapore, and because I'd read a little bit about, the really positive side of things that you were talking about, but also a sort of more shadowy side with migrant dormitories and, migrant workers being a place in Singapore where the virus wasn't contained so well. So I wonder if you could talk a bit about the politics from there.
Yeah, so Claire, thanks. As I mentioned, the Singaporean government, I think, was very clear. A lot of the policies and the decisions they take are based on numbers. And I think once, so the virus, when it actually spread within the expat community first, and then into the local community. And I think what the government was hoping was that it's not going to get into the dorms, because whereas the expats and the local community have the privilege of social distancing, unfortunately in the worker dorms, that doesn't really happen. But it did, and I think that wasn't supposed to happen. And once it did, it spread very fast. But then again, I think very quickly you had the government take a policy that we're going to have to test every worker. And, this is how it's going to be. And then very quickly groups sprang up on, chats that the workers need access to X, Y, Z, and can you please help out? So wherever there is an issue, I think there is a response. And I think that's there's a very rapid response, and the response is then implemented. In majority of the cases. There are always exceptions, I think, in any country. But what you have to marvel is at the seriousness and the harmony and the jointedness of the nation when it comes to implementing the laws. And, even just not whether the workers were well or not, but how were they feeling mentally? Were they experiencing depression? So you had groups where workers could call a hotline and talk if they were not feeling well. So I think that unitedness and that that they took a decision and everybody joined in, and even now when the numbers are unlike the rest of the world, Singapore is right now doing very well. There are hardly any community cases, but we still cannot meet in more than groups of 5. We still have to wear masks. The jointedness and the respect that goes into a decision, and then you follow that, it is remarkable, the way the nation operates.
And finally, Osama, any angle on this issue of politics or writers' responses or Pakistan or Lahore, where you are, anything at all, really?
No, actually, several things. I'm actually deeply political, and I'm not going to sort of lay out what the responsibility in general is, because that can become a bit didactic. But for me, myself, considering my background and what I do, there's politics involved in everything, and that's not necessarily bad. I mean, I think times of crisis and times of duress and pressure are normally divisive times because the stresses increase. And we've seen that's not just true for countries which are facing resource constraints. This can also be an outcome of information asymmetries, in trust deficit in the state, a sense and perception of lack of sort of equity in society. Look at the United States. Look at how differently two perspectives have emerged in terms of what ought to be done. I do agree with Bina that scientific knowledge, scientific approaches get swamped at times by emotions and politics. But I think we should also remember that in the early days, there was a lot of disinformation or lack of information, and people were trying to sort of cope with all that. I think another very important, two other very important dimensions. First is that one of the first casualties in situations like these in certain countries is free speech. If you recall the time immediately prior to COVID-19 breaking out, there were some movements, political movements, which were sort of flourishing in various parts of the world. And then with the clampdown and all, it gave the state in those particular countries a great opportunity to clamp down. And you could argue that, whether it was timely, whether it was totally motivated by health concerns or what was going on. Of course, the situation changed as we went forward. The other very important thing is that disease does not treat people equally. When I saw these sayings and quotations everywhere, I thought it was insensitive in the sense that obviously the kind of access to resources you have has a huge impact on how you're going to fare. And so there's a huge class dimension to this. There's a huge dimension of who is going to be more egregiously affected by this. And I think that raises a lot of issues, questions, and contestations, where it becomes sort of a responsibility to try and figure out the moral path, the more humanitarian sort of perspective of things, and try and push government policy and public opinion in that direction. So I think this entire time has been, in one sense, yes, an escape from all this and a personal sort of journey. But I think in many ways, quite a few people have been engaged with all these debates and discussions and even disputes, I would say.
That's great. You've given us a lot there. And I think I want to start with this point, important point about privilege, and you've all been touching on it. And Osama, you just made the connection with class quite rightly. I also wonder if we could bring in gender, because I'm thinking of Aysha starting by talking about her boys and her husband, and suddenly being on the table, they're trying to work, and and I know, Osama, you said it's been hard to write, so even privileged people in terms of class are having pressures of their own. I wonder if maybe start with Aysha to talk a little bit more about women and what's happened to them in this crisis.
So Claire, in 1998, I founded Caravan Crafts Foundation. We work with women in low-income communities in South Punjab. And when I relocated to Singapore, I continued to be on the board of the foundation. So for me, I saw the lives change very quickly. We work in economic empowerment, which means that we develop groups, and through value chain methodology, we connect women, rural women in South Punjab to markets. Development was actually my first love. So I saw their lives change very fast, because you see they're dependent on orders from the wholesalers and retailers in the city, and suddenly they were not being able to access the people upon whom they depend for their livelihoods. And if they do not get the cash, they don't have much savings. And their lives were suddenly, turned upside down. So it wasn't the disease so much that was terrifying for them. It was the fact that they needed to have, money to feed themselves, to spend on basic needs. And they didn't have it. So for us, we tried to, quickly revise the strategy. And I think for them, it was like going digital, trying to have exhibitions. But I think what that leaves you with, what you realize is gratitude, a huge amount of gratitude for what you have. Already, even if you're on the dining table, you are in a place where your basic needs are being met. If you need something, you will go out. There were stockouts here, but and every time a stock out happened, of course, you felt like, oh my God, I really needed that. But at the same time, I was so closely involved with Caravan. You just saw parallel lives being impacted in such a harsh way. And when I mean, nobody's out there to really help them or guide them. There is no local support. there is no communal support. Every household is really fending for themselves, and the men couldn't go out, the women couldn't go out. There were, the buses, so everything had shut down. So when you see that happen, I think I think the first thing that comes to your mind is gratitude for what you have, and then an element of sharing as much as you can, your knowledge, resources, and sort of trying to see, well, how can you then give more to others to get through this?
Bina, what would you have? You've got your blog, Feministani, and so I know that you're very interested in gender.
So there were a bunch of things happening with women, and I think Aysha touched on such an important part of it, the fact that, women who are struggling already to access credit and access financial tools and access, public transportation and all these things which are very, very, very much in the realm of development, governance, so on and so forth. The access was cut off because of the practicality of the lockdown. The majority of women who are employed, especially in the cities, are in three major areas: healthcare, teaching, and domestic work. Now, a lot of domestic workers got tossed out from their jobs because they are day workers. So they come and go on public transport, and people, the upper class people, middle class people who were employing them, were very scared to have these ladies coming and going from their houses. So they immediately became unemployed. Whoever could continue to pay their day help did, but that wasn't as much as it wasn't so it wasn't like a furlough. It wasn't like there was benefit support coming for everybody. So that was one area where domestic women workers got hit very hard. This didn't happen in the rural areas so much because women work in the fields and do all and the rural areas have been continuing as if there is no such thing as Corona. The teachers were being paid even though the schools were shut, but then as soon as the schools opened, they were required to come back into work. So they've been struggling. What I found very interesting was that the healthcare workers continued to work throughout, whether you were male or female. And what was really interesting was that there's a large group of medical school graduates, women, who are not able to work because of family and societal pressure after they marry. So they have a medical degree, they don't work, they're at home raising their families. What happened was during the lockdown and during the COVID crisis, there were quite a few initiatives to rope in these non-working medical graduates and get them to start doing telehealth and phone consultations for COVID patients. So that suddenly became an avenue of employment for this group of women who weren't typically working. So we saw all sorts of movement up and down the labor continuum, and it's still shifting and it's still settling. Now, of course, most day workers, domestic workers, have come back to their jobs. Masked or not masked, I don't know. It's very interesting. It's still in flux. But I would not say, like, for example, in Western countries, sorry, I'm going on a bit, but there were some of these very alarming statistics coming out that domestic violence had increased during the lockdown and so on and so forth. There were no studies to track that happening here, but I imagine that it did, just with the pressures of men being at home and not being able to work and financial problems and children at home and, the pressure cooker situation. So I imagine that there were problems with domestic violence. And throughout this time, we have seen an increase in sexual assault, some very egregious cases going on. So I do think that there is quite a lot of pressure that is spilling over and translating into gender-based violence. Mixed bag.
And finally, Osama, this question of gender, or also just the more broad point you started talking about, just inequalities in any kind of dimension.
So I guess on gender, a lot has been said, which is obviously very insightful. But one other dimension, in addition to that, which I've noticed, is that when schools were closed down, women who worked also all of a sudden found this additional responsibility to teach the kids, to take care of them. The autonomy they had in terms of working, was very much reduced because kids were now at home. So I think, and this is across classes, of course, manifesting in different ways. But, since the conventional expectation is that women ought to take care of them, in some cases, I'm sure men helped out, in others they didn't. But I think the additional load was on women. So that has been also very limiting for them. But in terms of class, as said before, I think the people who have been hit the hardest are the small businesses, the people who either work in households or run small businesses, and especially the people who had to step out every day, the wage earners, the people who have small food stalls and things like that, because of the consciousness that, there may be contamination because people were not stepping out that much. But these people had to step out every day. They didn't have the luxury of self-quarantining. The lockdowns hit them the most. I think also the people who were living in the most congested areas. So even though we moved from a sort of regular lockdown eventually to what they called smart lockdown, it's very questionable how close to the actual sort of ideal version of a smart lockdown it is, because that requires a lot of homework in terms of data collection and then sort of, modifying your policy in terms of what lockdown. But in any event, even if you do that, if you're living in a highly congested locality or in a very sort of overcrowded house, the possibility of really sort of trying to do social distancing or when you're using public transport, that was not there. We got very fortunate, and that's still, I think, a scientific mystery, and we'll eventually have the answer as to why COVID did not spread as fast and we did not have as many casualties. Of course, we're going through the second phase now, and because people did not take a lot of precautions and there were some policy failures, it's going up again. But for a long time in the middle, when the rest of the world was really sort of pressed to the ground with this thing, we were doing okay. But now that it's come back again, I think all those issues are still very much there, and the people who are the most vulnerable remain the most vulnerable. So I had one instance where, people reached out, are these people who are rag pickers or people who don't even have a job. These are literally people who either go for begging or they're sort of scavengers, they're squatters mostly, and pretty much they did not have any wherewithal now to sort of make ends meet. So, but then people took initiative in the community, cooked food for them in the instances I'm familiar with. But you can imagine with the kind of population we have, how many must have slipped through the cracks or how many people must have actually suffered.
So I think we've got maybe 10 minutes left. So I'll ask you one more question about your writing. And if there are any questions, if you want to ask something, you can put it in the chat and hopefully we'll be able to have a few questions from people who are watching. But my last question is about what you're each of you writing at the moment, and has this changed at all as a consequence of COVID-19, or are you just in your own fictional world and in an unaffected way? Maybe we'll go to Osama first, because you've said that you've actually mostly been reading. So, but are you getting writing done? What's the situation?
So I guess one of the additional pressures, at least which the writers have faced during this time, I don't know about others, but everybody expects you to be writing about COVID or writing something in the context of COVID, and the groups which are inviting and anthologies. It doesn't work that way for me. I can't, at least for fiction, I can't be commissioned to write something. I mean, I have to internalize it. It has to come from within me. In addition to that, I think the fact is that this has been a fairly traumatic 8-9 months, no matter what you say, the uncertainty of it, the misery of it. And I think we're still coping with it. We're still trying to rationalize it and understand it, and it's not over. So I think what I eventually come out with is bound to be influenced by this particular year and the coming months. What I had set out to write was perhaps less dystopic. It was political, it was somewhat historical, but I think in many ways it's going to be very hard subconsciously for me to escape some of the darker themes which have come forward. But also not just that, there's also hope. As I think, Bina, I think, said earlier, there is also, there is the human instinct to survive, to carry on. So I have made progress in terms of identifying a lot of themes which I want to connect, and I've done the initial sort of groundwork. I'm also someone who's not as well published as some of the other people here as far as fiction is concerned. So it's only going to be my second book. So I'm figuring out my methodology.
I think one of your books the equivalent of 4 of my books. So
That's not true. But no, that's kind of you, but that's not true. But my point is that the methodology which I used last time worked for me. I don't know whether it will work this time and whether we need to stick to one. So I'm sort of thinking that through as well. But I'm just having so much fun reading, and I'm being so lazy about it that I'm hoping that all this reading will sort of have some benefit for my writing. So.
And you mentioned the term dystopic, so I think that's a natural segue into Bina, who has, before all this, you were writing dystopian fiction in Before She Sleeps.
Yeah.
So what are you working on at the moment, and do you think it's changed because of our last 7 months?
you know what I'm working on, Claire. You've been reading, so Claire's been reading what I've been working on all along. She's one of my treasured readers. Wow. And I read this really wonderful essay just last night about how important it is for writers to have their first readers, people that they really trust. And this is a close circle of people that help bring a book into the world. It's never a solitary pursuit. It's always, you know, a joint effort. So that said, I'm working on the sequel to Before She Sleeps. And luckily for me, I had been working on this in the previous year. So it was just natural for me to keep going after sort of taking a break to adjust to the new circumstances. But I've just been continuing with that project. And I swore that, and you can't keep writing the same novel every day. You need to take breaks and you need to do other stuff a lot of the time. So I swore I wasn't going to do anything about the pandemic. And then I finally, 7 months, 8 months into it, I cracked and wrote a really great essay about Pakistan and the pandemic, which will be published sometime next month. So that's going to be interesting because I wrote it before I didn't think the second wave was going to hit us as hard. And so my editor said, let's hold on to it and see what happens in a month. I'm like, oh no, I'm already going to have to change this and do that. But I mean, honestly, I'm a very social person and I love to be out and about, and I haven't been able to do that. So consequently, I'm writing better than I ever have in my career. No distractions, no parties, no, I got to go here and do this. I got to make this speech. I got to go to this open, blah, 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 blah. So that's all gone. So all you have really is the writing. And it's a real life raft. I mean, it's a real sort of rope to hold on to in very difficult times. So I'm fortunate that the brain is working and I'm able to produce.
Aysha, where do you sit on this spectrum of lots of reading, lots of writing? Are you in the middle, or where are you?
So, Claire, I was approached by 2 publishers to write short stories for anthologies. One was on violence against women, something I feel very strongly about. It was an Indian publisher, and I think that just came out. It was just in the sort of the circuit breaker time. It's been submitted, and the other was on love. But before that, there was a work in progress. And I think for me, everything works in themes of lies, truth and lies, and power and poverty, and justice and justice. So I think even during the pandemic, this hasn't really changed. So the work in progress that I'm working on deals with these themes, and it's based in Singapore, in the city of Lahore. And I think those themes continue to haunt us even now. So it's something that I feel, whether it's not about the pandemic, it's set earlier on, in 2014-15, but I think the themes are similar to what's happening and what we see. So I'm working on that. I'm excited about that. I get lost in the characters. It's a character-based novel about women, coming into 40s and dealing with all these issues. So I'm excited about when I get into it, I get lost in the character, and then I'm lost for hours. And then I pull myself out and then start, read and then get back to it.
Great.
One sentence, if I may add, sorry. So I forgot this because I really want to mention it, not for myself, but for my translator. One of the big projects for me throughout this has been working very closely with my translator to get my novel translated into Urdu, which was a really fascinating experience. I've read translations before, but when you're working with a translator, and he very sort of joyously informed me it was refreshing for him because for a change, he was working on a translation where the author was still alive. So we exchanged a lot of notes, and he's a wonderful guy. And so it's done, and it's coming out in January. And I'm really excited about it because I really wanted the book to be much more accessible to people who get inhibited by English, because it's a book about this part of the world. So yeah, so in that sense, I've been productive. I was listening to everyone. I was sort of starting to feel rather unproductive. So I thought I'll add that. So
I think reading and translating it's very important, and I'm sure you're as busy as any of us. And I haven't done much writing either. I think this is, everyone's got they're at different stages of projects. We've got I'm editing like mad, and I'm so privileged of what you said, Bina, about I've been really lucky to read this novel in real time. So I've been reading a lot of other people's work. I've got a question in the chat about the differences between rural and urban populations. I think this has been just briefly mentioned, but I wonder if anyone could say a bit more about how coronavirus has impacted the urban areas more than the rural, or differences between the two.
I've been going into I've made 2 trips into the rural Sindh, and all I can say is that anybody that you ask, and I think this is more a class thing than a rural urban divide, but they're just like, there's no corona, nobody is sick, nobody is sick. I think that speaks to the lack of health care that is available in the rural areas, and also a sort of practicality about life. Okay, we're sick, get on with it. Not a big deal. But then again, our population is not heavy in the rural areas too. We don't have a lot of density. So perhaps it's true that COVID has really not spread as much in our rural areas, although more of our population, I think. Osama, I don't know, am I right or wrong in assuming that most of our population is rural? They're so spread out.
But you're right. I mean, it's not as congested because there are more open spaces. The problem right now is
outside. Everything is
everything happens outside.
Open air. People are working open air.
So they're not in enclosed spaces as much, and not in enclosed spaces with a lot of people, which seems to have a really bad impact in terms of spread of disease. The problem also is that we don't have really any disaggregated data right now to be able to tell which are the real flashpoints in terms of the spread of disease. There have been some super spreaders in rural areas as well, in India as well as in Pakistan. It seems to be largely a more urban phenomenon. The other problem is that a lot of the times the symptoms may be misread. So if you're close to a hospital or you can afford to get a test done, you can tell. Otherwise, it is quite possible that the actual casualties are higher across the board. It's just that we don't know because it disguises itself. The virus sort of manifests itself in different ways. And people who are already infirm or who have any underlying causes, this may become the trigger. But there's no way to actually capture that unless you test those people. And that hasn't been done, not just in Pakistan, all over the world. So I think it's a bit of an enigma right now. And we will find more with the passage of time in terms of whether the rural-urban distinction is an important one. On the face of it, it seems to be more of an urban phenomenon.
But just to add to that, I think that although the disease is not the issue in the rural areas, I think poverty definitely is, because the access to markets has been cut off. People they were interacting with, the fact that they can't go, they don't have orders, or they don't have work coming in from the cities which have been shut down is very difficult for them. It's very difficult for them to manage.
True, that's true.
But I would say that that's probably true for non-agricultural product, because your food has been coming in unstopped. Your produce has been coming in unstopped. We haven't had food shortages, thank God. I mean, that chain has continued unbroken throughout. And that's, again, testament to the fact that in the rural areas, people are not stopping for this. They're not locking down. They're doing nothing. They're just carrying on.
Bina, there's a comment for you in the live chat from Charmaine. She said, it takes a woman with immense confidence and modesty to say one of your novels equals 4 of mine. So she loved that comment.
That's true. Have you seen how long his book is?
But yours are, they might not be as big, but there's great quality there too.
Well, I was just saying he shouldn't feel non-productive, because my man is he's a force of nature in his writing.
Yeah. Are there any other questions, Saima, that you know of?
Claire, what are you reading during COVID?
Ooh, I've been a bit like Osama. I've been reading lots of pandemic fiction, and one of I read actually some real pot boilers, like A.G. Riddle's Pandemic, and it's quite interesting because it's based on a Ebola-style outbreak and in Africa, and yet nearly all the characters are kind of white saviors. So I kind of want to do something around formerly colonized countries and how they're responding to the pandemic. I think the sort of mainstream fictions that of the present day, I'm not talking about classics like Camus, but there's a token gesture towards developing countries, but really it's kind of white saviors, which I find really problematic. But I'm reading some good stuff as well. I'm not reading all horrible things. In fact, I'm reading 𝐂𝐨𝐫𝐸𝐬 right now. Never Let Me Go, like you've been reading 𝐂𝐨𝐫𝐸𝐬.
Wow, I love what a novel! Oh God,
that's hardcore. That's hardcore dystopia.
Tell me about it. Yeah,
and it's in
not
my
a good
ears.
idea.
It's audible. It's really disturbing.
Oh God. I see. Grace had a question.
Oh, Grace. Yes, got it. You can say.
Okay, yeah, there's been a comment on Facebook, so thank you for this comment and question. What are the reasons that such excellent writing in English is coming out of Pakistan and that there's so many new voices? So what are your thoughts on this?
I'm not new. I'm old. I'm an old voice. I've been around for a while, so since 1999. But I think that it's just we are just. There are a lot of people that are getting inspired by the previous ways of success. I think that now the old guard has been established a good 20 years and are winning major awards and doing big things and getting to, commentate and, and that just keeps inspiring the next generation and the next generation. And I think the old guard writers are very much in the state of pay it forward. They're always trying to promote new writers. They're always helping new writers. We all get requests and sort of, can you help me and how do I get published? And because it is such a small field in Pakistan, there's much more of a, well, this is what I did, here's maybe what you could try. There's a lot of cooperation between the generations now of writers that are coming up. And I also think that there's a recognition that our publishing field is very weak and people are trying to make attempts to ameliorate that or sort of redress that. So if a new publisher comes up, then a new publisher is looking for new writers. So it's a nice sort of a nice, what's the word I'm looking for? Symmetry, symbionts? Anyway, you know what I'm trying to.
Symbiosis.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Portmanteau.
Actually, you probably would be. You're the newest voice in a sense, because you, as you said, your probably longer career is, around, the activism and the work in the rural areas and things. So, yeah.
Claire, it's interesting because I was educated in English. I went to the American school. My mom was a teacher there. I think it was just easy to put me there. And I grew up thinking in English and writing in English all my life. I didn't even have to, after 6th grade, I didn't take Urdu. And after college in the US, when I wanted to work in development, I jumped straight back into the villages in Punjab. And so there, my part of my thinking was influenced by the 15 years I spent in the villages. So although I can express myself in English, a lot of my thoughts when it comes to writing about women and their experiences and their thoughts and how they overcome adversities are in Punjabi or Saraiki. So, those are the cultures sort of which those are the communities in which I worked. So it's an interesting mix, but when it comes to expressing myself in Urdu, I find myself limited, unfortunately, to be very honest.
That's very interesting. And since you've mentioned Punjabi, Saraiki and other languages, there's a specific question for Osama in the chat, and it's how have you found the process of translating your work? Have you found new meaning or nuances in your work from translating into Urdu?
So it's been exhausting. It's been overwhelming. It's also been rewarding. And the translation is actually done by somebody who's quite remarkable in terms of his own profile, Aysha Baqir. He does multiple things. But I work closely with him in the sense that I examined everything, I suggested changes, and since I have a fair amount of facility with Urdu, I had my own thoughts at times, and we had some wonderful collaborative sort of work on this and conversations about. But obviously, being the writer myself, in some ways I trumped when we had a stalemate, because I, being the writer, knew the nuance of what I was trying to say. But sometimes the Urdu equivalent itself adds a new meaning to it, which I'm sure is true, or I wouldn't say a new meaning, another facet or another dimension or tier to it, which is great, because I think translations should also work on their own. They can't just be literal. And then there were times when the translator actually came up with such fluent and lyrical sort of equivalents that I thought, great. And now that I read the book, since it is very much part and parcel of the context, it's a different book, but it's also an essence of the original book. So I think it's a creative process in its own right, totally. I mean, it's, and I've actually gained even more respect for good translators. But yeah, it's been an educative experience, but also exhilarating.
I think we've got time for probably the last question that I've seen coming in the chat, which is about literature festivals. We've seen a lot of literature festivals coming up in Pakistan in the past. With the pandemic, these physical events would be impacted. But do you think moving to virtual talks may serve to expand the reach of the writers more now, thus inspiring more young authors? Or are we going towards virtual overload? Very nicely put. So maybe Aysha, because we're here in a virtual forum, what do you think?
I think both have value. I think the connection, the human connection, is very important, and it cannot be substituted by virtual. When you meet someone, I've had the opportunity of attending 2 literary festivals in Lahore, one in Karachi and one in Singapore, and I think the human connections and the networks I made there are irreplaceable. And I don't think that's something that virtual is not going to escape that. At the same time, when you are in a virtual, and I've been listening to a lot of talks hosted by the Lahore Literary Festival, you do feel a closeness to the author, which you wouldn't otherwise, because you feel they're talking to you. So there's almost that a direct connection, and rather than being hesitant, and if you have any questions, you feel more liberated. It's almost liberating to be able to approach them and ask them questions and to engage in a discussion. Yeah.
So Bina, the last time you and I had that human connection, it was actually at the Karachi Literature Festival in this February, before, as Zadie Smith said, the global shit hit the fan. We were met just when I came in the country when the first 2 cases were reported in Pakistan. So what are your thoughts about how literature festivals are going to change?
Yeah, I'm so jealous, because just last week there was the Hong Kong Literature Festival took place in person, and I was just like, man, I miss this. I'm sorry, nothing can replace the personal, the physical literature festivals. Although I think they've gotten a bit zoo-like in the last couple of years. But again, there's just the buzz and the excitement, and you meet people, and you walk into the room, and you're hearing a talk from somebody that you had never heard of, and suddenly you find that you love them. And with virtual stuff, it's also deliberate, and you have to click a button and make a plan and add it to your calendar and blah, 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 blah. It's totally artificial. However, that said, I'm thoroughly enjoying this talk that we're doing right now. And I thoroughly enjoyed the last Zoom talk that I did. But I would want to keep it to a minimum. I would do 1 talk a month maybe, or 1 every 3 weeks. I wouldn't do 1 every day. And I'm very, very, very grateful that I do not have a book to promote at this time, because I think the hardest hit writers are the ones who have a book out, especially their debuts, and they were planning to do book tours and promotion at bookstores and signings. I mean, that's sort of like your reward after you've locked yourself in a room for a year writing by yourself. And they were robbed of that. And I feel very, very badly for them. And I'm sorry. We may never be able to do it in the same way again. I don't know. I feel lucky that I was able to experience the festivals and the book signings and the appearances and traveling for festivals. I've traveled to several. I've done residencies. I don't know when we're going to get back to that, but we need to. We need to. Bring on the vaccine.
And finally, Osama, you've got the law sort of academic side of things and then the creative side. So how do you feel this new world of Zooming is changing things?
So I mean, I quite agree that, one misses the festivals and the human interaction. But if you look at the flip side of the argument, leaving aside the festivals, you realize during these 7-8 months through Zoom meetings that a lot of the in-person meetings, and I'm talking about work, were unnecessary. You had to travel to different countries to attend a board meeting or to attend whatever. So it's obviously very doable. Turns out that, a lot of business can be done and you can leave less of a carbon footprint. And it's also much more convenient, because you basically have to wear a nice shirt because that's what shows. So
are you wearing shorts beneath? Are you wearing shorts underneath?
No, I've been very sort of, I've been observing the decorum, so I'm perfectly turned out. But I'm saying you have the choice. And I think it's a bit convenient at times, yes. But I think Zoom is here to stay. I think the world has changed now. We will go back to meetings. We will go back to festivals. I think there's another positive dimension to this. I think in some ways it's a bit more egalitarian. I tell you why. Doing a seminar, a workshop requires finances, logistics, things like that. So even festivals can only be done by a bunch of people, and they are exclusive in terms of who they invite. Whereas now, one of the most heartening things for me have been student societies at public sector universities, taking the initiative. They're not always that well prepared. It's not very, the interview is not conducted in a very sort of suave manner, but they're reaching out to writers, they're reaching out to people, they're sort of building their own little archives of interviews and things. And the thing is that you can go and sort of look it up. So it's also something which is getting recorded. So I think it's going to carry on. I quite agree with Bina that I think people who are invited, who are privileged enough to be invited, we need to have some self-discipline after a while, because otherwise you can just be Zooming. And so you need to pick and choose. I mean, I think in that picking and choosing, it's also important not just to talk to people one is comfortable with, but to also explore new dimensions and give younger people an opportunity for those collaborative enterprises. But I think it's important to be quality conscious so that when you get onto a Zoom call, you hopefully have something interesting to say. Otherwise, people will start hating you, and pretty soon you will become insufferable.
Well, I'm glad that you picked and chose this one today, and I think you've all had lots of great things to say. I've really enjoyed myself, and I'm very, very grateful. So, Simon or Grace, is there anything else? I mean, I admire Grace's background. If you want to come to York, this is the fake York backdrop.
Yeah, I should clarify, I'm not swimming, so it's just to hide my own background. But yes, don't worry, I'm not going to drown anytime soon.
I hope we might host some of you in person when the vaccine really takes hold, and you can come and see our lake properly.
Fantastic.
I think I've been to that building where
you have.
Where Grace is.
That's the. Is that the Great Hall, Grace?
Central Hall.
Central Hall, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, the spaceship-looking building. Yeah.
Yep.
And just behind there as well.
Me.
Yeah. Great.
Futuristic.
Great.
Thank
Thank
you,
you
Claire.
very much. Thank you
everybody.
so much, everybody. I really enjoyed this conversation, and we had some very nice comments and questions coming in through the chat as well. Thank you, Grace, for helping coordinate this. Thank you so much, Claire, for taking out the time to host this with us, and for inviting Osama and Bina. Thank you, Osama, Bina, Aysha, for being selective and for consenting to say yes to this talk. We're really honored, and we will be putting this up on YouTube as well. So hopefully more people will be able to see it if they haven't been able to join us live. And over to you, Grace, to say a final goodbye.
Thank you, Saima, and thank you again to Osama, Bina, and Aysha and Claire for your time today. It's been a fascinating discussion, and it's been great to connect with you in this virtual way, but hope to connect with you maybe in person at some point in the future. But thank you so much. It's been a really interesting discussion, and certainly a worthwhile Zoom event to attend and Facebook Live event to attend. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much for inviting us. It's been lovely to engage with all of you. Thank you.
Yeah. Lovely to meet you, Aysha. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.